Japan couldn't believe it. The United States was building submarines faster than Japan could sink them. Imagine being deep beneath the Pacific in 1943, the hull around you groaning, the air thick with diesel fumes, and every man holding his breath as sonar pings echo through the black water. Above, the Imperial Navy hunted relentlessly. But the Americans kept coming. One sub lost, 3 more launched. By the time Japan realized what was happening, it was already too late. In less than 4 years, the U.S. had turned its shipyards into war factories, a silent assembly line of steel sharks, each one more advanced, deadlier, and faster to produce than anything Japan could imagine. Men who had never seen the ocean before were now building machines that prowled beneath it. But how did America pull off this impossible feat? How did a nation crippled by the attack on Pearl Harbor become an undersea powerhouse that turned the tides of war? Stay with me, because what you're about to discover isn't just a story of technology. It's a story of desperation, deception, and the unstoppable will of a nation racing against time. And when you hear how it happened, you'll never see World War II the same way again. Steel under the sea, the ocean still burned. In December 1941, the waters of Pearl Harbor glowed red and black, choked with oil and twisted metal. The once proud Pacific Fleet lay shattered, the sound of explosions replaced by a terrible silence, the kind that follows disbelief. Men stood on the docks, fists clenched, watching the smoke rise. Some swore revenge. Others only whispered, "How could this happen?" Japan's Imperial Navy had struck with surgical precision, and it seemed unstoppable. From the Philippines to Wake Island, Japanese flags spread like fire across the Pacific. Beneath the waves, America's submarine force, small, outdated, and plagued by torpedo failures, was the only weapon left that could strike back. But even that seemed hopeless. The U.S. had just 55 submarines in the Pacific. Many were pre-war relics, cramped and unreliable. Their Mark 14 torpedoes, the Navy's supposed cutting-edge weapon, often misfired or detonated too early. Crews risked their lives only to watch their shots bubble harmlessly to the surface. Still, they went out. Imagine standing on the deck of a submarine as it slides into black water. The air turns cold, the light fades, and every groan of steel sounds like a warning. These weren't machines. They were coffins that moved. Yet the men inside believed in something larger than fear. They knew they were America's last eyes in a blind ocean. Their orders were simple: hunt the enemy. But in those first months, the hunted became the hunters. Japanese destroyers learned to listen for the faint hum of U.S. subs. The Imperial Navy's sonar, ping, 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 became a sound of terror. When depth charges fell, the ocean itself seemed to scream. And yet, even as these early missions ended in silence or death, a shift began, far away from the front lines. In California, Michigan, and Connecticut, vast factories came alive. What had once been car plants, machine shops, and civilian yards were now flooded with blueprints stamped "Top Secret, Navy." Engineers who had never touched seawater began designing vessels that could survive 100 feet deeper, travel thousands of miles farther, and strike harder than anything the Japanese had ever faced. One engineer, faced with impossible deadlines, wrote in his notebook, "They want miracles. We'll give them miracles." The miracle was steel. America learned how to bend it faster, weld it stronger, and shape it into something lethal. Where Japan built by hand, slow, precise, traditional, the U.S. turned to mass production. Shipyards began operating 24 hours a day, floodlights turning night into day. Men worked. Women worked. Even teenagers lied about their age to join. In one yard, a girl named Evelyn hammered rivets into the hull of a submarine. When she looked up, she saw rows of them. Not one, not two, but dozens being assembled side by side. By 1943, a new predator had entered the Pacific, the Gato-class submarine. Sleek, 311 feet long, capable of diving 300 feet below the surface. Each one carried 24 torpedoes, a deck gun, and a crew hardened by vengeance. It could stay submerged for 2 days, unseen, unheard. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, America could strike back. Hard. The Japanese were confident. Their destroyers ruled the seas, their convoys were tight, and their intelligence underestimated U.S. naval industry. They believed it would take America years to recover. But then, the sinkings began. Merchant ships, tankers, and even warships vanished without warning. Japanese captains spoke of phantom enemies. Sonar pings came too late. Periscopes appeared like ghosts and disappeared into nothing. The Imperial Navy couldn't understand how there were so many of them. What they didn't know, what no one could have imagined, was that by 1943, America was launching new submarines every 2 weeks. Every time one was sunk, another was already sliding down the rails into the water. Inside the Pacific Fleet's command bunker at Pearl, Admiral Charles Lockwood watched reports flood in. He had once feared they'd lose the war under the waves. Now, he whispered, "We've turned the tide." But beneath the victory reports, a darker truth simmered. Submariners were dying at a rate higher than almost any branch. For every steel hull launched, dozens of men were entombed in the deep. Crews who left port rarely came home. The ocean gave no graves, only silence, yet more volunteers came. Mechanics, farm boys, college dropouts, all drawn by one unspoken oath: to make the enemy pay for Pearl Harbor. They called themselves the Silent Service, not out of pride, but because their missions were never spoken of again. One such submarine, the USS Wahoo, commanded by Mush Morton, became legend. Morton and his crew hunted convoys near Japan's home islands. When cornered, he didn't dive away. He surfaced and attacked with guns blazing. He radioed back one chilling line: "We're on the warpath." Within months, Wahoo had sunk over 120,000 tons of enemy shipping. But in October 1943, it disappeared. No distress call, no wreckage, just gone. For every victory, there was a price. Still, the shipyards refused to slow. New designs replaced old within weeks. The Balao class arrived, capable of diving to 400 feet, longer range, thicker hulls. Japan couldn't believe the numbers. They estimated maybe 50 American submarines left in service. The truth was closer to 200. In Tokyo's naval offices, disbelief turned to dread. The ocean that once protected the empire was becoming a graveyard for its lifelines. Every ship carrying oil, food, or ammunition was a target, and the men on the bridges began to whisper that something impossible was happening. America was building faster than Japan could sink. Imagine the feeling of standing on the deck of a Japanese transport ship at night. The moon glows faintly over calm seas. Then, a distant splash. The lookout yells, "Torpedo!" But by the time he finishes, it's already too late. A flash, a roar, a column of fire where the sea used to be. And somewhere below, in the shadows, an American crew listens to the explosion and quietly cheers. But even as Japan scrambled to understand the industrial storm it had unleashed, another secret movement began beneath the waves, something that would make even their deadliest destroyers feel powerless. Because America's submarines weren't just multiplying, they were evolving, and soon the ocean itself would turn against Japan. The arsenal awakens. The clang of hammers echoed through the night like gunfire. Sparks flew from welding torches, and the smell of hot steel filled the air. Across America, cities that had once been quiet industrial towns now roared with life. It was as if the nation itself had awakened, a sleeping giant stirring in anger. The shipyards were no longer just workplaces. They were battlefields of their own. In Manitowoc, Wisconsin, a town hundreds of miles from the ocean, workers built submarines that would one day prowl the Pacific. Every morning, whistles shrieked as men and women poured through the gates, lunch pails in hand, sleeves rolled up, eyes burning with purpose. "Launch her before they can sink her," one foreman shouted over the din. It wasn't a slogan. It was a race against death. In just a few short years, the United States had achieved something no other nation had ever done. It turned war into mass production. What Japan crafted by hand, the U.S. built by assembly line. Every component, every bolt, every rivet had a number, a process, a timeline. Submarines that once took years to construct were now rolling off the slipways in months, sometimes weeks. But it wasn't just about speed. It was about reinvention. Engineers pushed boundaries that no one thought possible. The new Balao-class submarines could dive deeper, endure longer, and strike harder. Pressure hulls were thickened, engines refined, and sonar equipment upgraded. For the first time, American subs could challenge Japanese destroyers head-on and win. Inside one shipyard office, a young draftsman named Alan Reed stared at a blueprint covered in red marks. The naval inspector had written, "Too ambitious," in bold ink. Reed simply smiled, rolled up his sleeves, and said, "Then we'll make it happen anyway." Within months, his design, a redesigned conning tower for better stealth, was approved. Dozens of submarines were built with it before the year's end. Everywhere, small acts of rebellion like that fueled the machine. Workers weren't just following orders, they were daring the impossible. In Groton, Connecticut, at the Electric Boat Company, floodlights illuminated rows of half-built hulls gleaming in the mist. The noise was relentless, drills whining, steel plates being hoisted, sparks raining down like molten stars. Supervisors didn't sleep. They lived on coffee and adrenaline. One joked, "If we stop, the war stops." And in a way, he was right. Every submarine launched meant fewer Japanese ships at sea. Every successful patrol starved the enemy of oil, food, and ammunition. Yet not everyone believed it could last. Reports came in of submarines lost without trace, entire crews swallowed by the deep. Wives received telegrams that began the same way. "The Navy regrets to inform you." In the quiet kitchens of America, grief became part of the war effort. Still, the work continued. Even loss became fuel. Then came the moment that changed everything. In early 1943, a convoy of Japanese tankers was spotted near the Bismarck Sea. The USS Trigger, a Gato-class sub under Lieutenant Commander Roy Benson, lay waiting in the dark. Benson had been at sea for weeks, nerves frayed, fuel running low. He hadn't seen daylight in days. But when sonar picked up the rhythmic hum of propellers, every man on board knew. This was their chance. Benson whispered through the red-lit control room, "Set depth, 15 feet below keel." The order echoed through the sub. The crew moved like shadows, silent, rehearsed. They fired 6 torpedoes. Seconds passed. Then, a thunderous boom. The ocean erupted. Through the periscope, Benson watched one tanker lift out of the water and break in two. Flames raced across the surface, turning night into an inferno. The radio officer scribbled a single word in his logbook: "Hit Japan, never saw it coming." That convoy carried thousands of barrels of precious oil, enough to fuel warships for months, gone in minutes. But what truly shocked the Imperial Navy wasn't the loss. It was what came after. Within days, other convoys were hit. Different locations, different submarines, but the same precision. It wasn't one rogue American sub anymore. It was dozens. They were everywhere. Japan's admirals gathered in hushed panic. Their charts showed red X's spreading across the Pacific. Reports came in faster than they could read them. Merchant ship missing. Destroyer lost contact. Convoy under attack. "How many submarines do they have?" one asked. "Too many," another replied. In truth, America had launched 55 new submarines that year alone, with hundreds more on the way. It was as if the sea itself had turned American. But there was a darker side to that success. The faster the U.S. built, the more it demanded of its workers. Shipyard accidents increased. Fatigue set in. Men collapsed on the line. Some refused to go home, afraid that slowing down might cost lives overseas. At Mare Island, a welder named Thomas collapsed during a midnight shift. When medics lifted him, they found his hand still clutching the welding torch. Someone whispered, "He worked until the last bolt." By morning, his place was filled by another worker. No ceremony, no speech, just quiet determination. That was the rhythm of America's war machine. Relentless, unstoppable, and deeply human. By late 1943, the balance of power had shifted. Japan's once proud merchant fleet was crumbling. Submarines struck deep into enemy waters, sometimes surfacing to rescue downed pilots, sometimes to finish a crippled destroyer. They no longer ran from the Imperial Navy. They hunted it. But pride has a way of inviting danger. As U.S. submarines pushed closer to Japan's home islands, the ocean grew deadlier. New Japanese anti-submarine tactics emerged. Decoy convoys, sonar traps, aircraft patrols armed with depth charges. The hunters were now being hunted. One night, in the darkness north of Formosa, the USS Harder picked up a faint signal. An enemy convoy. Commander Sam Deely smiled and ordered, "Battle stations." They closed in, but what he didn't know was that the convoy was bait. As Harder prepared to strike, 6 Japanese destroyers converged. Their sonar pings echoed through the black water, each one closer, sharper. The crew held their breath. Then, a charge exploded. Another. Then a dozen more. The sea convulsed. Lights flickered. Steel screamed. The USS Harder never surfaced again. Yet in Washington, in the shipyards, in the hearts of millions, the work continued. For every submarine lost, 2 more replaced it. The Japanese Navy couldn't comprehend how it was possible that America had found a way to make destruction an industry. Still, as the war entered its bloodiest phase, whispers spread among submarine crews of something new. Something different being built in secret yards. A new design, faster, quieter, deadlier. Some said it was superstition. Others swore they had seen one sliding into the water under tarps and secrecy. Whatever it was, it promised to change everything. And soon, it would. Silent hunters. The sea was black that night, a perfect mirror of the sky above. Somewhere in that endless dark, the USS Tang slid silently forward, its engines barely a whisper. Inside, the crew spoke in murmurs, breath shallow, ears straining to hear the faint pulse of sonar. Each man knew that one wrong move, one metallic clink, one echo too loud, could mean the end. It was 1944, and by now, the U.S. submarine fleet had become a living nightmare for Japan. The Imperial Navy could no longer predict where the next attack would come from. American submarines seemed to appear out of nowhere, strike with precision, and vanish into the deep before the alarms could sound. But this wasn't luck. It was mastery. The new generation of American submariners had become predators of the deep, part sailor, part assassin. Their world was pressure and silence, sweat and shadows. They could sit motionless for hours, listening through the steel hull for the faint hum of propellers miles away. The Tang's commander, Richard O'Kane, was one of the best. Calm, methodical, unbreakable. He treated every mission like a chess game, his mind always 3 moves ahead. On that cold night in the East China Sea, his crew had been stalking a Japanese convoy for nearly 16 hours. Now, as radar showed the shapes of tankers and freighters clustered together like sheep, O'Kane leaned over the periscope and whispered, "Fire 1." The torpedo hissed from its tube, followed by a second, then a third. The crew held their breath. A heartbeat later. Boom. Then another. The sea erupted with flame. Men shouted, gripping the steel rails as the shockwave shuddered through the hull. Through the periscope lens, O'Kane watched ships break apart, their decks swallowed by fire. He said nothing, only whispered, "Reload." For the next hour the Tang circled unseen, striking again and again. When the last torpedo fired, 5 Japanese ships lay burning on the horizon. The mission was a triumph, but in war, even triumph carried a cost. As the Tang turned to leave, O'Kane decided to fire one final shot. A last torpedo at a crippled freighter. The weapon malfunctioned, circled back, and struck the submarine itself. The explosion tore through the hull, throwing men into darkness and chaos. O'Kane and 9 others were rescued days later, the only survivors. The Tang was gone, another ghost added to the deep. Stories like this spread across the fleet, each one a mix of glory and loss. Crews celebrated victories in whispers, always knowing that tomorrow might bring silence instead. Yet the mission continued, because every Japanese ship sunk meant fewer weapons, fewer rations, fewer soldiers on the front. By now, Japan's empire was bleeding from within. Its shipping routes, once busy with supplies from the Dutch East Indies and China, had become death traps. Submarines cut through them like knives through silk. Some Japanese captains refused to sail. Others took to praying before every voyage, knowing they might never see land again. One officer wrote in his diary, "The ocean belongs to America now. We sail across our own graves." Back in Pearl Harbor, Admiral Lockwood read reports stacked high on his desk. Sinkings, losses, tonnage destroyed. He should have felt satisfaction, but all he saw were the names of missing boats. Wahoo, Grunion, Scamp, dozens more. Each line represented men who had simply vanished. He closed his eyes and said softly, "We're winning." But the ocean takes its share, yet something about those missing boats haunted him. Too many had disappeared near Japan's home waters, where enemy patrols were thickest. He ordered an investigation, and what they discovered chilled him. Japan had begun deploying a new weapon: sonar-equipped hunter-killer groups. Fast, agile destroyers operating in coordinated packs. Their tactics mirrored those of the submarines themselves. For the first time, the hunters had become the hunted. In May 1944, the USS Seawolf narrowly escaped such a trap. Her sonar officer picked up multiple pings closing in fast. 4 destroyers. The captain ordered a dive. The hull creaked under pressure as they descended past 400 feet. Depth charges followed, shaking the vessel like thunder. Lights flickered, pipes burst. The air filled with the smell of oil and sweat. Hours passed. The crew lay still, barely breathing. When they finally surfaced at night, the destroyers were gone. The Seawolf survived, but barely. Many others weren't as lucky. Even so, the submarine campaign pressed on. America's industrial machine didn't slow. It accelerated. The shipyards launched boats faster than Japan could sink them. Crews trained faster, torpedoes improved, tactics refined. For every trap Japan set, the U.S. answered with innovation. The shift wasn't just mechanical, it was psychological. Submarine commanders learned to weaponize fear itself. They began attacking convoys at night, surfacing among the enemy ships, guns blazing. It was madness, and it worked. Japanese sailors panicked, firing wildly into the darkness, unsure where the enemy was. The sea turned into a theater of shadows. On one night patrol, the USS Barb surfaced off the coast of Hokkaido. Commander Eugene Fluckey ordered his men to fire torpedoes into a convoy. Then, in a daring move, he took the sub ashore. A small team crept inland under moonlight, planting explosives on a railway. Hours later, they watched a train full of military supplies explode in a fireball. It was the only ground action of the U.S. Navy on Japanese soil, carried out by a submarine crew. These were no longer sailors. They were ghosts with steel hulls. By the summer of 1944, Japan's merchant fleet was collapsing. Out of the 6 million tons it had at the start of the war, barely a third remained. Factories starved of raw materials, fuel reserves dwindled, and warships sat motionless in port, unable to sail. The empire that once stretched across the Pacific was being strangled, not by bombs from the sky, but by silent hunters beneath the waves. Yet even as America celebrated its undersea victories, rumors began to spread among intelligence officers of something strange. Reports surfaced of Japanese engineers working on a super submarine, faster, larger, capable of carrying aircraft. If true, it could threaten everything the U.S. had gained. Lockwood dismissed it at first, until reconnaissance planes spotted a massive silhouette under construction at Kure Naval Base. Something enormous. Something new. He stared at the blurry photograph on his desk, heart pounding. "If that thing sails," he said, "we'll have to rewrite the rules of war." What no one knew was that Japan's last gamble was already taking shape, a desperate weapon meant to turn the tide once more. And soon, the silent hunters would face something they had never imagined: the turning tide. By early 1945, the Pacific had become a graveyard, not of ships, but of empires. Japan's once unbreakable naval machine was crumbling, its arteries of supply cut open by an unseen enemy beneath the waves. The U.S. submarines were no longer a desperate defense. They were a force of nature. The Japanese called them the Steel Demons, and by then, the name fit. Tokyo's harbors were half empty now, their quays littered with rusted wrecks. The great tankers that once fueled the Imperial Navy sat idle, stripped of engines and hope. Factories sputtered out, starved of oil and iron. Entire fleets lay trapped, not by enemy firepower, but by absence. The sea that had once carried Japan's lifeblood had turned hostile, haunted by the silent hunters America built faster than Japan could bury them. But the empire refused to surrender. In their desperation, they turned to something extraordinary. In a secret dock at Kure, Japanese engineers labored in silence. Hidden beneath steel arches and blackout tarps, a massive submarine took shape. Longer than a football field, capable of carrying aircraft within its hull. It was the I-400, a weapon born from panic and pride, meant to strike the American mainland itself. Only 3 would ever be completed. When American intelligence learned of its existence, they were stunned. A submarine that could launch bombers? It sounded like fantasy, yet reconnaissance photos didn't lie. Admiral Lockwood stared at them for a long time before murmuring, "They're running out of time." And they know it. The race was on. Not to build, but to finish the war before these monsters reached the ocean. While Japan gambled on its secret weapon, the U.S. Navy tightened the noose. In the Philippine Sea, wolf packs of submarines worked in coordinated formations. 3, sometimes 5 subs, communicating silently through coded radio bursts. They struck convoys with terrifying precision. Ships vanished nightly. The ocean, once a vast sanctuary, had become a maze of death. One Japanese sailor later recalled, "Every splash sounded like a torpedo. We prayed to die on land." But even as victory drew closer, the men of the silent service carried a private dread. They knew the sea showed no mercy. Not even to the victorious. Many boats that left Pearl never came home. Families waited for telegrams that never arrived. And still, new submarines were launched. Balao after Balao, sleek, silent, relentless. In one California shipyard, a crowd gathered to watch the launch of yet another vessel. The christening bottle shattered, champagne splashing across its silver hull. As the submarine slid into the water, a welder in the crowd whispered, "There goes another ghost." Back in the Pacific, beneath crushing depths, the crews felt that same haunting weight. Inside the USS Archerfish, Captain Joe Enright studied his sonar display as a strange echo flickered across it. A massive contact, slow-moving and unfamiliar. He ordered the sub to dive deeper. "Hold course," he said softly. "Let's see what we've got." Hours passed. The shadow loomed larger. It wasn't a destroyer. It wasn't a freighter. It was something enormous. The men waited in silence. Then, the sonar operator whispered, "Sir, it's a carrier." Enright's heart pounded. A carrier that large, alone in deep waters? It didn't make sense. He tracked it for hours, studying its speed, its strange shape, and then he realized it wasn't an aircraft carrier. It was one of the new Japanese super subs, the Shinano, the largest warship ever built beneath the waves. He fired 6 torpedoes. The first missed. The second hit. Then another. The ocean trembled. Through the periscope, Enright saw a massive column of water erupt, followed by a sound that shook the bones. The Shinano, pride of the Imperial Fleet, symbol of Japan's last hope, rolled on its side and vanished beneath the surface. The hunters had won again. But even victory carried no joy anymore. By now the submariners had seen too much. They had sunk ships filled not only with soldiers but civilians, laborers, and prisoners. They didn't cheer as they used to. The sea had stripped away the glory and left only survival. In Tokyo, the Imperial Navy met in near darkness. Power blackouts had become common. Admiral Toyota stared at a map of the Pacific, Red lines once marked Japanese control. Now, they barely reached beyond the home islands. "We cannot fight what we cannot see," he said quietly. By that spring, the final blow was visible to all. Japan had lost 4 million tons of shipping in a single year. Oil reserves were nearly gone. Battleships sat motionless, their guns rusting in silence. And yet the Americans didn't stop. The factories kept roaring, shipyards kept launching. Submarines now rolled out faster than the crews could be trained. It was an industrial flood, and Japan was drowning in it. Still, the U.S. submariners didn't feel invincible. Every dive could be their last. Every sonar ping felt like a heartbeat counting down. Inside those steel tubes, they lived in a world of red lights and recycled air, the constant stench of diesel and sweat. They dreamed of sunlight, and sometimes forgot what it looked like. The cost of that relentless pace was steep. Crews cracked under pressure. Commanders broke into fits of rage or silence. Some boats returned to port with half their men changed forever. But there was no slowing down, because every sub that surfaced meant victory moved closer. When news came that Japan was preparing to defend its home islands, every captain knew what it meant. The war was reaching its end, but the bloodiest chapter was still ahead. The U.S. Navy prepared for an invasion unlike anything before. Submarines were reassigned to blockade duty, choking Japan's ports completely. The sea was sealed. And in those final, suffocating months, Japanese ships stopped sailing altogether. They had nothing left to move. The war that began with a surprise attack from the sky was ending beneath the sea. But even as Japan's empire collapsed, a strange message reached Admiral Lockwood's desk, intercepted from a submarine off Japan's coast. Its code was unfamiliar, its tone desperate. Analysts decrypted it slowly, line by line, until the final sentence froze them. "We are carrying a new kind of weapon. America must not find it." Lockwood stared at the words, his coffee gone cold. He didn't know yet what that weapon was, or if it could change the war's ending. But he knew one thing. The ocean wasn't done revealing its secrets. And somewhere beneath those dark waters, something unimaginable was already moving. Legacy of the deep. The war was ending, but the ocean was still restless. Even as the bombs fell over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, submarines prowled in the dark, unaware of what was unfolding above. Their missions hadn't changed. They still hunted, still waited, still listened to the hum of enemy propellers that rarely came anymore. For the men beneath the waves, there was no victory parade. There was only the sea, endless, cold, and unchanged. In those final days, radio silence was broken by fragments of news. Japan was collapsing. Surrender was near. Yet, deep under the Pacific, many submariners refused to believe it. They had spent years in shadows, where truth came in coded bursts. Hope and rumor sounded the same through static. One morning, the USS Sea Devil surfaced through fog off the coast of Kyushu. The sky was ash-gray, the air heavy with a strange stillness. Captain Walker climbed the conning tower and looked across a horizon littered with debris. Oil slicks glistened like black mirrors. A fishing village smoldered in the distance. For the first time in years, he saw no ships to hunt, only silence. He removed his cap and whispered, "It's over." But even in peace, the ghosts of war followed. The silent service had claimed more than 1,200 Japanese ships, tankers, freighters, destroyers, even carriers. They had strangled an empire with torpedoes and patience, yet they paid dearly. 52 American submarines lost, more than 3,000 men entombed forever beneath the sea. No graves, no markers, only names carved into cold stone. When the surviving crews returned home, there were no grand parades waiting, no crowds cheering. Their missions had been classified, their victories unspoken. Some sailors stepped onto dry land and felt dizzy, their bodies swaying to waves that no longer existed. Others never adjusted. The sound of dripping water, a creaking floorboard. These became echoes of depth charges in their minds. Still, the world they helped shape was changed forever. The submarine, once a desperate weapon, had become the future of naval warfare. The lessons learned from the Pacific built a new kind of deterrent. Faster, quieter, deadlier. The same ingenuity that once churned out the Gato and Balao classes now birthed nuclear-powered giants that could circle the world without surfacing. But for Japan, the memory of those underwater hunters never faded. The empire that once ruled the seas had been undone not by grand fleets or massive armies, but by the relentless rhythm of American production. For every vessel Japan sank, 3 more emerged from shipyards glowing in the night. It was a war of industry as much as steel and blood, and Japan had never understood the scale of what it had awakened. In post-war Tokyo, one former naval engineer spoke quietly to an American officer, his voice filled with disbelief. "We thought you would take years to recover," he said. "We did not know you could build faster than we could destroy." The officer nodded. "Neither did we, until we had to." Across the Pacific, the shipyards that once thundered with war fell silent. The welders laid down their torches, the cranes froze mid-air, and the lights dimmed for the first time in years. Factories that had built submarines turned back to cars, refrigerators, and dreams of normal life. But in the quiet corners of those empty docks, rusting hulls remained, reminders of the storm that had passed. Yet, some secrets never rested. Months after the surrender, an American salvage crew located something extraordinary off the coast of Honshu. Buried in the silt was one of Japan's super subs, the I-401. Inside they found not weapons, but aircraft, folded neatly in hangars, each fitted with bomb racks designed to carry biological agents. The Japanese had planned to strike the U.S. West Coast with plague-filled bombs, launched from beneath the ocean. The crew said nothing publicly. The discovery was classified, buried in archives for decades. History would remember the bombs dropped from the sky, but not the ones that almost rose from the sea. Admiral Lockwood, upon hearing the report, stood silent for a long time. "So that's what they meant," he said quietly, remembering the intercepted message. "We are carrying a new kind of weapon." It was over now, but the knowledge chilled him. How close the world had come to a horror unseen. The submariners who had fought in that vast, invisible war scattered back into ordinary life. Some became teachers, engineers, fathers, but at night they still dreamed of the ocean. The crushing pressure, the ping of sonar, the slow heartbeat of machinery. They had lived between breaths, in silence and shadow, and though history rarely told their story, they carried it inside them. Years later, one veteran returned to Pearl Harbor. He walked along the quiet memorials, reading the names of the submarines etched into stone. When he reached Wahoo, he paused, touching the name with trembling fingers. "We built them faster than they could sink them," he whispered. "But God, we paid for everyone." The sea breeze carried his words away. In the end, the story of America's submarine campaign wasn't just about machines or numbers. It was about people. Welders who built in sleepless shifts, sailors who fought without witness, engineers who defied physics, and families who waited by radios for voices that never returned. It was about the impossible. The moment a nation learned to turn grief into momentum, fear into innovation, and loss into resolve. Japan could not believe it. Even decades later, historians in Tokyo struggled to comprehend how a country shattered at Pearl Harbor had risen so fast. Their admirals admitted what they never could during the war, that the battle for the Pacific was lost not in the skies or on the beaches, but in the factories of America, where submarines were born faster than the sea could swallow them. And so, the ocean keeps its secrets. The wrecks still sleep beneath miles of water, American and Japanese alike, silent witnesses to a time when the world fought for breath. If you listen closely, the Pacific still whispers their story. The creak of distant metal, the faint echo of a sonar ping fading into the dark, and somewhere down there, beneath the waves where daylight never reaches, the ghosts of those submarines still drift, reminders of a time when steel, courage, and will alone decided the fate of nations. They were built in fury. They fought in silence, and they changed the course of history forever.